Hello and welcome to All Things Apostolic. My name is Kasey Sees, and in today's episode we're going to discuss calling, but from a little bit of a different perspective. Hello and welcome to this episode of All Things Apostolic. Today I am back in California. I am back from traveling in Pennsylvania. And today, to be exact, I'm actually in Turlock, California, where I currently pastor. Over the past couple weeks, or months rather, here in Turlock, we've seen great revival. The church here in Turlock actually started January 7th of this year. And since January 7th, we've seen 30 people be filled with the gift of the Holy Ghost. Right now, our average attendance fluctuates between 60 to 70, so I'd say we've got about 65 people that show up on Sunday for church, and our midweek service is actually averaging somewhere around 55, so we're seeing a high percentage of those that come on Sunday there on Wednesday nights for service as well. The thing with revival is that revival also presents itself with unique issues or unique challenges to revival. For instance, where we're currently at, we are again averaging between 65 and 70, and the sanctuary that we have service in currently holds approximately 100 people. And so one of the challenges that we're going to have here probably in the near future is as we close in on that 100 number, we'll begin running out of space. But the more pressing issue for us right now is that the place at which we have service, there is no off-street parking. And so all of the parking is on-street. To further make matters a little bit more difficult is that the church is in the middle of a residential area. And so not only is there no off-street parking, there's a lot of parking around us that is taken up by houses and people that live close to the church. To further complicate matters a little bit more, within the area in which we hold service, there are probably 4 or 5 denominational churches within a 2-block radius. And so Sunday morning, this creates a rush for parking spaces, if you will. Everybody that has a church down there is kind of fighting over where to park the cars. And so because of that, we are currently looking for a new building. We're looking for a new property to lease, and we think we may have found one, but right now we're currently looking at 6 or 7 different buildings. Some of these buildings are warehouses, some are storefronts, and some of them are churches. In one particular issue, it's a church that is not currently being utilized. It's an older sanctuary. And so we're making progress in the discussion of where we're going to be located next. And so hopefully I can give you some good news in the next few weeks about our relocation and where we find ourselves for having service. But in the process of looking for a new building, a couple things are evident that sometimes I think we overlook. And so as we look for a new building, the processes and things that are involved in looking for a new building has to do with lease agreements. You have to have someone that understands lease agreements, understanding price per square foot, and here in California, what they call triple N or triple net. And so it's not just the square footage price. So if you're looking at a building that's $1.20 a square foot, well, you may be able to say, well, 5,000 times a dollar, or 5,000 square foot times $1.20 is $6,000, But you have to also factor in triple net, which sometimes is up to 20 cents a square foot. So that's an additional $1,000 in your rent if you're looking at a 5,000 square foot sanctuary. And so here's some of the things you have to look at. Not only that, you have to look at what build out is going to be required as you look at this new sanctuary. If you're looking at a warehouse, most warehouses aren't going to have AC and heating. I currently pastor in Turlock. Turlock, just the past couple of weeks, have been about 115 degrees, fluctuating between 50 to 60% humidity on top of that 115. And so having ACs is a requirement. And so if you don't have an AC in a warehouse, not only do you have to put one in, do you have people that are qualified to do so? or are you going to have to parse this out to somebody outside? In addition to the AC question becomes the question of classrooms. What about sound equipment? Does it hold up good to acoustics? Is it something that's going to require you to do a lot of running of wires and all these different things? What about the zoning of the property? How is the current property zoned? Are there things that they're going to require the city, the county, the state? Is there things that they're going to require? If you're in a warehouse, what about plumbing and bathroom? Do you have enough bathrooms within the four walls of the sanctuary, or within the four walls of the building, rather, to be able to adequately serve the people you're ministering to? And so all of these issues that we talked about here, all of these things in the process of a new building, really shows you that there are certain skills and a certain level of understanding that is required. And so while I have some level of understanding and the things that I don't know I can research, there are some people that are gifted at that. There are some people that already have this skill set. There are some people that God has called to know these types of things, and he's put in them special skill sets. And so what I want to talk a little bit about today is business, teaching, counseling. All of these things are as much of a calling as the pulpit. Unfortunately, a lot of times we look at the pulpit as if the pulpit is the highest calling. Now, I believe that we need people in the pulpit, and I believe that people are called to preach. But I would argue that the highest calling for the individual is the call that the individual God has placed on the individual. And so if God has called you to preach, then preaching is the highest calling. But if God has called you to business or teaching or counseling, then it is business, teaching, or counseling that is the highest calling for you. Because the highest calling is not a particular position. Rather, the highest calling is to walk in the call that God has placed upon our lives. And so when we read the Bible, when we read the book of Genesis, the Bible tells us that before God is called loving, before God is referred to as holy or merciful, God is referred to first as someone or something that is creative. God is creative. And so one's work as an entrepreneur and a creator honors God because they're created in God's image. And so when we look at God and we look at the creation of the world and we look at the way in which God created things, what's interesting to me is you look and God creates, he creates the sea, and then he fills it. He creates all of these things and then fills it. And so what God did was God created things for the good of others, right? And so God created humanity. He created humanity in an environment in which humanity can thrive. And so when we look at one's work as an entrepreneur, it is primarily the creation of goods for others. We see in the example of Bezalel. Bezalel created the tabernacle of the Lord. And the Bible says the way in which he created this tabernacle was because the Spirit filled him, because God anointed him to do such a task. And so while God creates, it's evident that God also expects us to create too. And so the Bible tells us that God created the animals, but God didn't give the animals names, right? It was through Adam that these animals were named. God created land, and God created water, and God created bodies of water. But God did not create the irrigation systems needed for this. God depended upon man to do this. I remember hearing a story, a somewhat comical story, of someone talking to a young kid about a garden and how beautiful the garden was and how much God did and the beauty of it. And the kid replied, well, yeah, you should have seen what the garden looked like when it was just God. In other words, you should have seen what it looked like before my dad was here to till it, before my dad was here to fix it up. And so God creates what he can create, but God also expects us to come alongside and create with him. God created the stars, but God did not create an application on our phone that allows us to see the stars by name. And so we were called to create. And now for some people that is in the realm of entrepreneurship. That maybe you're a painter, maybe you are an artist, maybe you draw, maybe you create songs, these types of things. We have to get beyond the point of just looking at calling as a calling to the pulpit, but we need to fulfill what God has called us to do. When we look at Genesis, the Bible tells us that he created humans, he created us to fill the earth. And so when you look at that word to fill the earth, I would argue that fill the earth is not just procreation, but it is also discussing about civilization as well. And so to fill the earth isn't just procreation, but to fill the earth is to create things that are for the benefit of others. And so in order to do this, one of the things we have to do is realize the inherent good in work. And so a lot of times we have this understanding that work is a bad thing, or work is something that is the byproduct of the fall. But when we read in Genesis, we come to the realization that work was something that God had implemented. He needed a man to till the earth. It's something he implemented prior to the fall. And so work is inherently good. It's not something that's bad. Part of the garden was based off work. And when we get to heaven, I think we'll realize that work is also a part of heaven. And we know this because Revelations 22:3 says that when we're in heaven, we will serve him. And so serving is part of our work. And so we see in the garden paradise that work was a part of garden. And we see in Revelation 22:3 that work is also a part of heaven. Because work is an act of worship. Say that again, work is an act of worship. And why is work, or how is work an act of worship? We see work as an act of worship in the garden when Adam is obeying what God has called him to do. God has called him to name the animals. God has called him to till the ground. God has called him to replenish, be fruitful, have dominion, and subdue. When he walks in the calling upon him, it is an act of worship. And so if God has called you to business, if God has called you to be a teacher, if God has called you to be a counselor, if God has called you to do something, when you walk in your calling, when you walk in what God has called you to do, it is an act of worship. And so again, before we end today, I want to say the highest calling is not to be a preacher. The highest calling is not to be a pastor. The highest calling is to be whatever God has called you to be. And so if he's called you to be a pastor, that's great. That's the highest calling for you. If he's called you to be a preacher, that's awesome. That is the highest calling for you. But if God has called you to be an entrepreneur, if God has called you to business, whatever God has called you individually to do, that is the highest calling for your life. Thank you for joining me on this episode of All Things Apostolic. I look forward to seeing you on the next episode. God bless.